In the next 12 chapters, we'll turn our attention to the nitty-gritty of how to work with a virtual set. But let's first talk about match moving on a green screen. Putting 2D into 3D is not much different from putting 3D into 2D, except for one very important difference. In live action, there are usually thousands of things to track, and it's actually a rare shot that can't be match moved, at least wide shots. But on a green screen, there's nothing to track. So we literally have to hand feed the software by putting something in. And if we don't, in case it's not clear, there's just no way to match move it, and the shot might not survive post-production. Most people know that they have to put in tracking markers, but most people also don't realize that match moving is fundamentally different from 2D tracking, resulting in shots like these that have plenty of markers, but no parallax, so they're not going to work. We'll spend the next 2 chapters showing you exactly how to rig and shoot your green screen. And the first thing we need is a great marker setup. We have 3 things we need to figure out. First, the color of the markers, the shape of the markers because they're not all equal, and most importantly, the placement. We need to get a little bit technical because they often have to be placed without any visual effects people on the set. Starting with the color, the match moving software would love for us to use black or white markers because they have the best contrast. But the shot also has to be composited, and black and white markers would have to be painted out by hand, which is extremely hard, and basically impossible behind hair. So we need a color we can key, and there are 2 ways to do that. First, to choose another primary color like blue. Then we first do a key to get rid of the markers. And then we do a second key to remove the background. The downside, of course, is that we have a second illegal color, which is frustrating for wardrobe and props. But what's worse, most cameras can't handle such a hard color transition, with the result that the key will leave behind these kinds of footprints. And the same happens on all cameras if the marker's out of focus. So colored markers can be a big mistake if the circumstances aren't absolutely perfect. The second approach is to use green markers in a different brightness than the green screen, and hope that the keyer will grab them. As long as they're about a half stop different, the match moving software can see them. The downside is that the ideal keyer settings don't remove the markers, so we have to crunch the key to get rid of them, shrinking some edges in the process. So the way to key them out is to first do perfect keyer settings, then do a second key that crunches out the markers, and then use garbage mats for each marker that gets near the edge. So we only crunch the edge where we have to, but key normally everywhere else. It's very hard to tell the difference in the final composite. Green markers have other problems. For example, that they don't look fantastic through shadows. But there are ways to deal with that, and we'll use green markers because they're the lesser evil. It's unlikely we'll find off-the-shelf tape in just the color we need. So we have to make the color ourselves and literally paint some tape. You need to use white gaff tape because it has a rough surface the paint will stick to. Nothing will stick to duct tape. You can't use masking tape because the glue becomes permanent after a week. And you can't use laser labels because they're permanent right away. The goal is a green that's about a half stop above or below. And in Photoshop, that's about 20 RGB values above or below, and especially the green channel, but not anymore. To make these colors, you mix 1 part white paint into 4 parts green paint for the bright markers, or 1 part black paint into about 70 parts green paint for the dark markers. And then you paint the tape in 3 coats. We ended up using bright markers. But dark markers have a slightly more true color and avoid the risk of clipping. The next important question is the marker shape, which is an area with a lot of religion. There are some basic rules. First, that trackers prefer corners or pointy ends because no matter how the size changes, a corner is always a corner, so it looks the same to the tracker. That's the problem with dots. When they're small, they're ideal markers because there's no way to misunderstand them. And they're perfect for motion capture because they're rotation independent. But in match moving, markers change size a lot, which makes dot markers fail because the dot pattern suddenly doesn't exist anymore. So people have first of all tried tape squares, or thin crosses, or thick crosses, all of which have lots of corners and can produce up to 12 trackers. But there is another problem, that as soon as you see them at an angle like on the floor, many of the corners wash out, and we really only get 2 or 3 trackers per marker. So then some people have switched to triangles, or triangles with an inverse triangle inside. And these are much better on the floor because it takes more distortion to wash out their corners. But the fact is that all shapes have bad angles. And since markers are usually placed in a grid pattern, it's possible to hit an unlucky angle for all markers at the same time. And that's why some people have turned to a completely opposite approach, which is to plaster the green screen with random shapes at random angles. And this really works. For this course, we tested every known shape and color and pattern once and for all to find the best one. And random markers outperformed every other shape. They can be a little hard to see, which is unfortunately the goal. We'll talk about the exact placement in the next chapter. For now, let's talk about the overall plan for getting the best match moving. It's very important to again understand that match moving works on the parallax, and that means the difference between how the foreground and the background are moving. The magic number is a minimum of 7 things to track at different depths that show a clear change in perspective. So this shot is fine. If a shot only has markers on a single plane, it'll either fail, or if you remember the discussion on jitter, extrapolating the scene from points that are far away amplifies the pixel error 100 times out near the camera. And that's why the camera was shaking. And the 3D sticks were jumping all over the place in this shot. The computer needs both clear foreground and clear background to figure out the camera position. In wide shots, floor markers give enough foreground. But in medium and close shots, they're all out of frame and we're stuck with the background again. Remember that we can't track the actor because the points have to be static. But that leaves just a few points on a single plane, which is not enough. So what do? Well, you build 2 microphone stands with tape marks or post-it notes that you know will get tracked, and put them anywhere you need to beef up the parallax. The marker should be a different color than anything in the background, but it doesn't matter what they look like because they'll never be composited. This close push would be a difficult or a failed match move. But with the mic stand, there's a clear difference between foreground and background. And this is now a push-button match move. To put it in perspective, this shot took a couple of hours to match move in composite. Without the mic stands, it might have taken days, or it would have failed as a match move. Then we'd either have to try 2D tracking, or faking the camera move, but we're likely not getting the shot we imagined anymore. Other ad hoc sources of parallax are grip and lighting gear. And all this junk that often ends up on the green screen is great for match moving, so leave it in there if it doesn't interfere with the composite. And down the same alley, if you're shooting something that will end up as widescreen or scope, but you're shooting at full frame, don't do anything to block out the top and bottom in camera, like matte boxes or flags. Finally, your camera settings can actually make markers invisible to the tracker. Shallow depth of field and motion blur wash out markers. And even if it's just for a second, in that time we ruin everything we've worked to do right. So shoot with the smallest aperture you can afford and a shutter faster than 1/100th of a second. In a grid pattern for one very important reason: that we need some absolute points for scale and survey. If you remember, a scale reference is two markers with a known distance between them. And if we have a recognizable shape every 1 or 2 meters, we'll have a scale reference in almost every shot. We'll do triangles, which are the best of the primary shapes, made out of 2 strips of tape so they never get too small and turn into dots. To measure out a grid, some people like laser levels, but we like a more old-school way of a microphone stand measured out to 1 meter by 1 meter, a meter yardstick, and a piece of string with a nut at the bottom for measuring the upper rows. Then we start in the corner and find the spot where the arm can exactly touch both walls. That gives us 3 reference points to start from, which we'll mark with a pencil. And then we just build out from there. To find the next horizontal mark, we use the yardstick to find the next floor point, and then the next wall point, and mark it. To find the upper rows, we hang the string, which has 2 black notches for a meter, and mark the upper point. For the floor, we start a long piece of string behind one of the meter marks, and line it up with the meter out at the other end. And then we make notches along the string every meter. And finally we attach the triangles so they barely cover the pencil mark. It's important to pick one corner that represents the actual grid point so it ends up getting tracked. So here's our final grid. And let's turn up the contrast to see it better. And that brings us to the random shapes. When we say random, we really mean 3 shapes: angles, bars, and dots. On a small green screen, we can make them out of marker tape torn in half. On a large green screen, you might have to do full-width tape marks. Then we just make it an art project and put the markers all over the green screen at about 5 per square meter. And that's assuming a small green screen like ours. The goal is to be as random as possible. And if it looks like somebody threw confetti at the green screen, you've done it right. So here's our final green screen, which looks like a mess, but it's perfect for match moving. Some people think this is too many markers. But as soon as we get into close shots, it's not too many at all. And this gives you a real-world filmmaking freedom that you just don't get from the systematic grid setups, where the markers always seem to be in the wrong place. Still, if you're on a big green screen like the Laurel Canyon stage, or you don't have a single close shot, you can do half the markers and be fine. Remember that our markers are pretty dense because our stage is very small, and you have to scale it up for a bigger stage. At this point, you should get a scale reference, which is really important on a green screen. So roll 2 seconds of film describing the measurements, and which corner represents the grid point. Also measure the mic stands because sometimes they're the only reference in the shot. And make a unique mark on each stand so you can tell them apart. So let's do a test shot. This shot is nice and wide so we can see tons of markers. We're shooting high speed, which doesn't really change anything for the match move. Then we use rough keyers and garbage mats to prevent her and the fan from getting tracked because the points have to be static. And then we match move it, which is literally a push-button match move. We use 2 triangles to set the scale so it'll fit right into 3D. Then we do a test render on a textured surface to check the floor registration. And what we're looking for is that there's absolutely no sliding of her feet. Some sliding can come from a bad match move, but some of it can also come from lens distortion, which we'll talk about in a minute. We're going to put her into an embassy scene, which is one of the scenes we'll work with in the next chapters. In Maya, we're free to position the match move to make the scene happen anywhere. We simply rotate and shift the entire camera move around to get the perfect framing. And if you're directing, you should make sure to be there when this is done for every single shot. It's usually good to overlay the green screen plate to see where she'll end up standing. And just like in a real shot, it's good to do some last-minute set dressing to maximize the sense of parallax and make the framing more interesting. So now we get extra sense of parallax from the column and the table. Then we do a low-quality test render. And the point of all these test renders is to catch problems with the match move before we commit lots of resources to the final renders. Because everything becomes irreversible right about now. Because then we render and composite the full-quality version, which took several days to render because of the global illumination. The muzzle flares and the extra in the background are 2D footage placed in 3D space. Of course, the story in the shot doesn't make a lot of sense. But every virtual set shot goes through the same process. And it's very flexible in the beginning because we can place the shot anywhere we want. It's just important to understand that things get really locked as soon as we commit render time. And there's no going back unless you don't care what it costs. Previews are much cheaper, and the longer you can live with them, the more creative freedom you'll have. So this is a general-purpose marker setup that will take care of all your wide shots. But it's important to be aware that some close shots will still not have enough markers. We have to spot those situations even if it's just part of a shot and put in some markers to beef up the match move. The magic number is again a minimum of 7 markers at different depths. And it only takes a second to realize it and fix it. It's also important that the points are absolutely static. Here, the post-it notes are flapping in the wind, so they have to be excluded from the tracking. With her also excluded, that leaves just a few markers to be tracked. We're still getting about 20 tracking points, but we're sneaking up on a failure. So it's always better to have too many markers, especially if they composite right out. So that's basically it. But there are a few important things we haven't dealt with. The first is that the moment we bring back the black cloth to cancel spill, almost the entire grid work disappears and there's nothing to track. But if you remember how much better the shot is with the spill cloth, you almost can't shoot without it with a good conscience. The solution is to make the cloth trackable by taping it up with white markers. They'll never get composited, so it doesn't matter what they look like. And as long as we can see part of the original grid, we have all the scale reference we need. So this match move is again push button, but it will key 100 times better. There's just one rule, that the cloth can't move, not even a millimeter, which invalidates all the points. So you have to weigh it down and not touch it during the shot. Also, keep a comfortable space around the actor so the cloth is never constraining. We're going so close over here that a shadow from the cloth ends up behind her. Secondly, there are specific things you can do to prepare for an emergency. First, you absolutely categorically have to get helper frames, which are the nice and wide still pictures from 5 or 10 angles. The animators can use them to survey the stage and save impossible match moves. So when your markers are stable, 5 or 10 pictures from different angles can save the day. And if the setup changes, like with the cloth, get 10 new pictures. Secondly, someone needs to shoot a distortion grid for every wide-angle lens. We're shooting with a pretty cheap one here, and we have to copy all this line bending for the plates to line up. Mismatches in distortion can again cause sliding, which gets worse the further we get away from the center of the lens. With the distortion grid, we can make an identical warp in the composite and use it to warp the 3D plate to match. There's a PDF on the website, but any grid will do. When you shoot it, make sure it's flat and full frame. Longer lenses don't usually need a distortion grid because even cheap lenses are pretty straight. Finally, there are sometimes shots that just don't work, mostly close shots. But there is a last-ditch option you should know about, which is to fake it. Basically, if you can't see the actor's feet on the floor, it's not that easy to see if the camera move really matches or not. We can exploit that by going into 3D and animating something that we think looks right. And with any luck, it won't be that bad. In the composite, the plates look totally out of sync because we're not matching the wobble in the pan tilt. But if we track a point on the actor, we can extract the wobble. And when we apply it to the background plate, it looks pretty plausible. This technique actually really works, but only on medium and close shots and people who don't move very much. Very lastly, remember that many shots don't need match moving at all. For lock shots, all you need is a single marker, or 2 if you want to Dutch tilt the camera. And then it's much easier to just forget about match moving and do them the old way. The only hard part is to match the camera height between the 2 plates. And it's not that easy to figure out if this is really the right height. So you again do the animators a huge favor if you measure the nodal height, which is the distance up to the middle of the lens. You should do this for any shot there's even a chance will have to be faked in post. Like the shot from before, or basically any close shot. So now we can finally get started working on a virtual set. To do that, it's common to bring a simple keyer onto the set and do on-set compositing, so let's talk about that first. On-set compositing can be both a blessing and a curse. With an on-set keyer, you'll do better light matching than you could ever do on gut feeling alone. But there are some important downsides. One being that you also start trying to match people to the 3D set without realizing how flexible it is in post. People's pride also gets in the way, because they'll waste time trying to create a final composite on the monitor that everybody's looking at. But worst of all, it means that everyone's attention will be over on the monitor, instead of out here in imagination land where everyone's mind should be. The actor suffered tremendously from having the shoot turned into a science project. And you'll get the best result if you just check the lighting on the keyer and then turn it off, and rely on your intuition in a video tap. Green screen can be a wonderful exercise in total imagination, and you should all be creating this new world, not just subordinating to it. Now, when we talk about matching lighting on a virtual set, we really mean two things. First, of course, a live-action character being put into a 3D set, but also a green screen element simply being put into another live-action shot. We'll cover them together because they're almost the same, with one very important difference. When we're doing a 3D set, it usually exists ahead of time, so we know what we're matching. But if the 3D set doesn't exist, or we've made a mistake, there's always the possibility of changing the 3D set after the fact to match. We don't have that option if we're matching an already shot background plate. So it's a one-way street, and we have to get it right. So this is a good time to use an on-set keyer, because otherwise you're blindfolded. One of the biggest mistakes people make in matching lighting is to do nothing, and hope that it can somehow be lit in post. This is catastrophically wrong, and we have to put it up on a sign. There is no way to light people after the fact. It has to be done on the set. Natural light is infinitely complex. Here we have a soft key light coming in from the right, some bounce on the shadow side, and a rim. The shadows curl up around her face, and the rim picks certain strands of hair to light up. There's no way in post to fake what the light would have done on the set. To make a shadow side, we could try making a garbage mat and bring down the left side. To make a rim, we could offset the key mat and subtract it from itself, which results in a thin outline on one side, which we can use to color correct that side up. But let's be honest, this looks ridiculous, especially when we put it up against real lighting. It only barely works on people who are far away. So it's extremely important to make some lighting decisions on the set, and that's what the next chapters are about. Set, we might know that there's a window over here, and the character is standing here. So placing a key light here will take care of it. Then she walks over to the light, and then she responds to the window in the composite. By the way, the key is so noisy because we didn't use spill cloth. There's an enormous amount of freedom to set the light direction because the eye can't tell with any precision if the direction is really right or not. So in the composite, this will be as good as this. We can even go as far as matching only the overall left or right direction. But it's important that we do make a decision. Especially if the 3D is merely being built, the direction is not known yet. And in that case, we have to decide then and there what the lighting is. And the 3D people will be happy to match it. If the set is not known yet, it's extremely important that you basically make up a set in your mind. Light it, and then the 3D folks will have to match it. But you'll be much better off with even a crude preview render, and you should pretend to refuse to shoot without it. If you're matching live action, you need to determine the light direction in the background plate. And the first thing to look for is which side is the brightest. Sometimes there's a clear key side. On an overcast day, the light tends to be soft with a bias towards the sky. When we're with our back towards the sun, the light is also soft, but with a rim. Even though the sun is technically the key, you should treat this as soft skylighting with a rim as an accessory. Another way to read the light direction is to look at the shadow direction, but only as an overall guide. You only have to match it accurately if you're actually going to extract the shadows, which we'll talk about later. And if the shadows are just a small blob under things, it indicates a soft overall light from above. It's also important to notice if there are multiple light sources. In addition to a rim and a skylight, this shot has heavy bounce from the house on the left. We should try to copy all these sources. However, some DPs go a step further and also throw in a backlight to make the edges pop in the composite, which is a bad idea. Or even worse, do a magenta backlight to cancel green, which is deadly. You shouldn't do any tricks to help with the composite. Although it's of course fine to do a backlight if you would have done it anyway on a real location. Moving on to the quality of the light, by that we mean whether the light is hard or soft. Hard lights emanate from a single point, like the sun or a street light, causing a hard shadow. Hard lights are the least beautiful because even skin blemishes cast a shadow. So hard light is usually something you do to either get a chiseled masculine look or simply because you're trying to copy sunlight. Hard lights are also limited to a single source because multiple lights cast multiple hard shadows that are a dead giveaway you're on a soundstage. Soft lights are soft because they're physically larger, so the shadow is more undefined. Since the light is coming from many directions, no small bump can cast a shadow, making skin appear softer. The easiest way to detect light softness in a background plate is to look at the shadows, whether they're hard or soft. You can also look at specular highlights. If the object has one, there's a hard light somewhere. Most indoor light is very soft with a bias towards window sides and light fixtures. But the same as you often do rims in regular shooting, even indoor where they're totally unmotivated, it's totally okay to do them if it works for you creatively. When we said before not to do backlighting, we only meant not to do them to help with the keying. When copying soft light, we're not trying to literally measure out the size of light sources to nail an exact softness. All that matters is whether the light is hard, medium, soft, or very soft. The eye can't tell much more than 3 or 4 grades of softness. Matching sunlight is much more difficult. And you have to know that indoor sunlight will never look completely like real sunlight no matter how much your DP tries to convince you. So consider outdoor green screen for anything that takes place in sunlight. If you want to try your hand at indoor sunlight, these are the goals. First of all, you need a point light, meaning a single extremely powerful light like an 18K HMI. You want it to be as far away from the actors as possible because it makes the light rays more parallel like sunlight. If the light is too close, you get warped shadows. Ideally, you want a stage with a high roof. So you can hang this single point light all the way up here. But such a stage is hard to find, so you need to bring the light down here, forcing a light angle like morning or late afternoon. So in practice, if you can trust the weather, you're much better off simply shooting it outdoors where the lighting is free. On the downside, if you're extracting shadows, you have to plan your wide shots for the time of day where the shadows have the right length. It's much easier to fake a different time of day in closer shots. Finally, we need to match the ratio, which is the difference between the key side and the fill side, which can be very big, like a 6-stop difference, or very small, like a 1-stop difference. These have to be the same as in the background plate because it's a dead giveaway if the ratios don't match. All you have to do is eyeball the difference in the background plate and match it. If you're matching a 3D set that hasn't yet been lit, you'll again have to make a decision that the 3D people will have to follow. On-set compositing can be a great educator when it comes to ratio. But the most important part is that you do some sort of ratio, because then the compositor can increase it by working the contrast button, or decrease it. This is an important point because a mistake most DPs make is to not shoot with enough ratio. And then the compositor doesn't have anything to pull contrast from. We just end up torturing the image. So always make sure to do at least 3 stops of ratio to give the compositor something to play with. Unless the goal is completely flat lighting. There's one more thing to match, which is the color temperature, but this is a little harder. As a general rule, you should shoot things clean. So even if something is supposed to be very reddish or very bluish in the final composite, you get a better recording and a better key by shooting it clean, and then color correcting it in post. That makes it hard to use on-set compositing because doing it right will look wrong, but it's much better for quality. However, there are two situations where you want to shoot in the final light. The first is if you have multiple color temperatures, like if you have a yellowish key light with a bluish rim. You have no choice but to shoot that as it'll appear. Secondly, if you're doing a night shot with a rim, but you shoot it at normal light levels, when you print it down, you also print down the rim, turning it gray. The only way to have the rim properly exposed is to shoot the actor dark as she will appear. And then we're much more realistic in the composite. Or by creating a fake shadow based on the actor's outline. To extract shadows, we want the clearest possible shadow on the green screen with the highest possible ratio. Some DPs try to nail the final shadow contrast on the set, but this is usually a bad idea. Because while it is possible to pull a shadow as part of the key, we'd much rather pull out the shadow as a separate element, because then we can control the shadow ratio in the composite, and color correct it too, which is just as necessary. To do that, we need the darkest possible shadow. Then we pull two keys, one that keeps the shadow, and one that crunches it out. And when we subtract them from each other, we get just the shadow. In reality, we also get an outline because the two keys are different, so we also need to garbage mat it. But then we have an isolated shadow. Then we first key in the actor with her original shadow. And then we use the isolated shadow for additional control. So there are two shadow layers, the one that came with the key and the one we added. And now we can control both the ratio and the color. The darker we shoot the shadows, the easier this is. If you're on a clean green screen, extracting is fairly easy. But if there are many markers, it's much harder because the markers are a different brightness and show through. There are really only two ways to deal with that. First, to just live with it, which can actually work if we're compositing people over a complicated floor. Since the audience doesn't know what a marker is, they might assume that that's what the floor looks like. The second option is to do a key for each single marker, and garbage mats to isolate the work area. But this would be a giant composite, and it still wouldn't work in transition areas. So this is not realistic. The only way to really do a clean shadow is to either tear out the markers in the entire shadow area, or cover them up with clean green sheets, which is the easiest way. So always have 4 or 6 extra boards. And overlap them with the edge away from the camera, which makes them seamless from the camera's perspective. Then we can do a walk. Our stage is unfortunately too small to cast proper shadows. And the light is just up to the right, so the shadows are warped. But the boards keep the markers away, and there's still plenty to track. So it's an easy match move and an easy composite. When we're casting shadows on a 3D set, there's usually no point in trying to precisely match a shadow angle from 3D test renders, because the 3D set can always be adjusted after the fact. But if we're matching a plate that's already been shot, we need to carefully match the angle. And this is something that can't be done without on-set compositing. Then you simply move the camera or the lighting until the shadows line up. If you don't have a keyer, you can also just switch between the two sources. Or worst case, bring a printout and try to eyeball it. Now, a situation you'll eventually run into is that the virtual set isn't simply a flat floor, but the actor will move among objects, which creates a unique shadow casting problem. If the shot is a match move, or in this case a lock shot with helper frames, you can put in a box to cast shadows on. And if you make sure that each side of the box has a marker that'll be match moved or image modeled so we get the 3D coordinates, it's possible to build a pretty accurate box that matches. And now we're casting shadows onto a 3D object. It's very important that we're basing this on a match move or an image model, because if we just try to put in a box without that kind of help, we'll have a very hard time lining up the 3D box with the real one, resulting in misaligned shadows, which looks bad. The shadow falls over the edge at the top and short of the edge to the right. And even with the help of markers, this kind of shadow casting falls apart when the ground is more complicated, because these shapes are just too hard to match. So putting in green shadow receivers is really not a very good way to do it, and we'll show a much better way later. Now, while extracting shadows looks better than faking them, often you can't control your lighting enough to get a real shadow at all. And in that case, you have to fake it. Faking shadows basically involves starting with the matte, then warping it down to the floor, and using it to color correct the background. And then here's the composite. But it only works if the shadow is supposed to fall away from the camera, or towards the camera, because the actor is just a 2D element and has no mass from the side. So this becomes less accurate the further we get away from center line. It also doesn't work well if people are standing with offset feet, because by its very nature the distance gets flattened out when we warp it down to the floor. It's definitely possible to shear it back into place, but this will look increasingly unrealistic. The most difficult part is when people move, because the warp shadow has to be animated to move with them. And this can be difficult. Even in a lock shot, you have to do major animating and shearing to make it fit. And it doesn't really stand scrutiny because the shadow is too thin in certain parts of her walk cycle. If the camera is also moving, this animating can be very difficult. And nearly impossible with this kind of camera work. On the upside, faking the shadow opens the door to casting a real contour shadow in 3D, at least in theory. By using the green screen mat on a polygon and then ray tracing a shadow, and then of course we can cast as complex shadows as we want. The problem with this is that unless people are standing more or less still, we first need to stabilize the actor to keep her in the same part of the frame and the same size, which can be difficult on a moving camera shot. And then we need to animate the polygon to exactly recreate her movement in 3D. Remember that to the computer, she's just some pixels on a plane in front of the camera, and it doesn't know her movement in 3D. So it has to be hand animated very precisely. So for these reasons, faking shadows is actually difficult and only works on flat ground. A possible plan B is to instead decide that the virtual set lighting will be soft. Collapse a shadow at the actor's feet. Blur it, and now we have a soft midday overcast shadow. This kind of shadow is much easier to deal with. Finally, even if you don't want to retain the live shadow, you always want to keep the contact shadow, which is the soft shadow under people's feet. There's an important psychological effect to this shadow. And without it, people somehow look like they're floating. So never try to light or key these shadows out. They're a good thing regardless of what lighting you're otherwise trying to create. To receive shadows on a green screen, in principle we just set up shadow casters and do the same in reverse. But in reality, it's actually much harder. It would be great if we could just fake receiving shadows in post. Then anytime an actor moves into a shadow area on the virtual set, we just paint them dark. But that unfortunately doesn't work. Real shadows are extremely complex. Here the shadow both creeps and crawls over the contour of her face, and doesn't cause double shadows where her face is already dark. To fake it, we'd have to somehow make a garbage mat that wipes over her face and darkens it. But the end result looks ridiculous because it doesn't respond to the contour of her face. And there are double shadows everywhere. The consequence of this is important, because it means that the only way we can get an actor to walk in and out of shadows is to cast actual shadows on the set. The most difficult kind of shadows to cast are shadows that have to fall in specific places. In this garden scene, we would have to duplicate each of the pillars. Since the 3D set already exists, we can measure the pillars. And these are 15 centimeters wide and 89 centimeters apart. We're doing this shot outdoors because only sunlight looks like sunlight. We've then built these towers with foam board on the front. And they're placed to have 89 centimeters from middle to middle. If the 3D set didn't exist, we'd have to decide then and there where the shadows would have to fall. And then the 3D set would have to be built to match. Then we shoot the plate. As she steps forwards through each of the shadows, they move over her body in a way we could never fake. After the match move, obviously the first thing we have to do is match the light angle. And a couple of quick test renders take care of that. We're not free to position the match move anywhere because we want the shadows to line up. And then here's the 3D plate. When we composite her into the scene, just like in the last chapter, we need her shadows separate so we can color correct the ground. And the only way to do that is to pull two keys, one with a shadow and one without, and then subtract them from each other to get the shadow. Then we can color correct the ground. But here's where it gets difficult because we're getting double shadows. And we need to exclude the 3D shadows so we don't color correct the ground where 3D has already cast shadows. So we've rendered a 3D shadow pass, which we can subtract. And then we get no double shadows. And like before, we've garbage matted it, so we only do this on the ground. Finally, we simply key her on top and color correct. And then here's the final composite. The key needs some work in the beginning. But the shadow casting actually really works. And we only get a single layer of shadows on the ground. So this is very effective. But fact is, this is both a difficult shoot and a difficult composite. You can make things dramatically easier by not shooting full figure. The entire problem in the previous shot was the ground shadows. And as soon as we're medium or close, it's much easier. We first of all don't have to worry about double shadows. But more importantly, we don't have to match them accurately, because the eye can't really tell if the shadows are motivated or not. And it's great for realism. The same goes for receiving light. And by that we mean stepping into hot spots. In close shots, we can keep the background green while we do basically any kind of lighting. So unless we're way off for the scene, who's to say there's not a fan to the right? But when we're full figure, we're limited by the fact that we can't light the actor separate from the green screen. It's no problem to make a hotspot, but it's useless unless we can bring the green screen up back here. But when we do that, we lose the hotspot. The only way to do this is to backlight that part of the green screen, which can work if you're okay with an extra shadow and a rim. But it will give lots of glare that has to be polarized, which will cost 2 stops of exposure. The moral is that if you want a guarantee of no problems, only receive shadows and hotspots in medium and close shots. Doing them full figure is much more demanding. Finally, a couple of quick notes are that if we're shooting in real sunlight, it doesn't matter if shadow casters are close to the actor or far away, because the light rays are parallel, so the shadow size is always the same. So we didn't really care where the shadow casters were standing, only what the distance between the shadows was. Also, only do this with hard shadows. Remember that soft shadows can be difficult or impossible to exclude. Since we're just fading it on top, we still keep the reflection from the window in the background. In a real shot, the new object would stop the reflection from the window. But the eye isn't very good at telling if reflections are correct or not, so it usually doesn't matter, wrong as it is. Then we can adjust the reflection to match the plate, like blurring it, which matches the marble, or we can displace it, which matches water. Unless the person in the camera are standing completely still, the reflection also has to be hand animated to stay at their feet. But this is harder than it looks. In the embassy scene, we hand animated it. But in the final shot, the reflection is actually bouncing a little. So it takes a while to get it right. However, fake reflections are very limited, because they only work when we have a clean line to flip the pixels around. So offset feet don't work. The only solution is to try to warp her back into place. But this can become very unrealistic if we do it too much. Fake reflections also don't work in high angles, because it's almost impossible to fake what the reflection would have looked like. Such a reflection gives a completely different angle on the actor, and we can't copy that just by mirroring pixels. Or here, this prop will never become a mirror in the composite without us basically shooting a second camera angle for it. But for regular walking and talking from a low angle, you can get away with just flipping the pixels, as long as you're okay with it not being totally realistic. For anything else, you unfortunately have to shoot a real reflection. You can either do that with a mirror, which produces a reflection that's too strong for most people, or you can lay out plexiglass or another material that's only half reflective. Then we're free to shoot the most impossible angles. And on plexiglass, we can even pull a shadow at the same time. The downside is that it's a very complicated setup. We first of all obviously can't reflect any lights. But what's worse, we can't have any tracking markers, not under the plastic and not in the reflection. The reason is that when we key things that are transparent, like shadows, or clothes, or reflections, we can't crunch out the markers without crunching out the reflection. So you have to clear out the markers, especially under the reflection, by either tearing them out, or better, by bringing back the shadow sheets and putting the plexiglass on top. Then for match moving, we need to rely on markers off to the side, so this only works in wide shots. But we get a much better extraction. Still, real reflections are complicated enough that you should avoid them whenever you can. The second half of reflections is receiving them from the environment, like these live-action windows. It's pretty easy to receive reflections onto a static object that's part of the set, like a glass wall. Then the glass is just a fixed 3D object that reflects some environment texture. It's much harder to receive reflections on a moving object because we have to find a way to track it in 3D. So starting with the easy one, a typical example is if we want to put her inside this 3D aircraft. The glass needs to reflect the sky, so it's pretty much hopeless to do a reflection on the set. But since this is a virtual set shot anyway, it's almost no work to do the glass in 3D. And then we can reflect anything. So here's first of all the plate, which is like any other virtual set camera move. Then here's the match move. And this is where she'll be placed. We've also extended the match move at the beginning and end, which we haven't talked about yet. For the composite, we have a bunch of layers. But most importantly, we've rendered out the glass in a separate pass. Then we first composited her on top of the airplane. Then we have a separate piece of the fuselage to mask her inside the plane. And then we use the matte of the glass to first darken the background, which is like a tint. And then we screen the glass on top. And then here she is inside the cockpit, which is very effective. There's a lot going on here, and we'll return to this shot in the next couple of chapters. But for now, the point is that it's very easy to make any static part of the set reflect anything we want. Because of the match move, we know the exact 3D coordinate the glass is supposed to be at. It's much harder on a moving object because unless we've done a motion capture, we don't know where it is in 3D space. So to do sunglasses, well, first of all, it again would make sense to do them live because they would just reflect the soundstage. That would be okay for small random glints, but not for big solid reflections which need to reflect the virtual set. We can of course try to fake it by just keying in some graphic and maybe trying to track it to the actor's face. But it looks very fake because the angle change in sunglasses is actually complicated. Here we are in real life, and left-right turning looks different from up-down turning, which looks different from tilting, which looks different from changing height. And we have to copy all that, including the fisheye effect you get in the reflection. So this is actually a 3D effect, and to do it right, we have to track the 3D movement of the glasses and do a real reflection in 3D. So you need to see this as a virtual prop and follow all the rules for it, and we won't cover all that again. But in short, we first shot a plate with 10 markers, although we only need 7 or 4. And then we've done the all-important survey shot. To extract coordinates from the glasses. This shot just wouldn't solve without the survey, so you really do need it. Then here's the inverted match move, and you can see the points are moving instead of the camera. Then we've built 2 slightly rounded glasses. And an environment to reflect, like a giant IMAX screen. Here's a render of the reflections. And when we key them into the plate, it's a real reflection. Obviously, we can only do a solid reflection, and we can't see the actor's eyes. But this looks almost right. Although it's a lot of work, and you're much better off if you don't choose to do it in the first place. Obviously, we've already covered most of this in the interaction chapters. But we still feel some of the things need their own explanation from a green screen perspective. Our first concern is obeying the geography of the virtual set. So if we have a chair here, we need an identically sized thing to sit on that'll key out. And in the composite, she then sits down on the 3D chair. This is where working to scale becomes important, because then we can measure out objects on the virtual set and know exactly what size to build them in real life. But in truth, if you build the wrong size for the shoot, you can always resize the 3D chair to fit. You generally need very little planning if you only have one place to sit, or one place to put something, because then you can just put it anywhere, and then reposition the match move to match the 3D to the live action. If we have more than one object, like several places to sit, we need at least a general idea of what goes where. But again, it's just as okay to simply make something up on the set and match it in 3D later. When people are sitting, it's best to use solid boxes because they're simpler lighting-wise. painted furniture has parts that end up in the shade, which means that the range the keyer has to grab is bigger. Boxes also have a dark side, but it's pretty easy to fill in. You don't want to cast hard shadows on the box, because they won't work for the 3D chair afterwards. But if people are going to be handling the furniture, or need a specific sitting experience like leaning back, you need to paint a chair. Now, handling furniture is actually a big problem because we need a way to track the motion. Ever so often, you see people doing this on a green screen. Or this. And it's pretty much deadly because there's no good way to track it. It's very important to consider that if you want to move anything on the set, it has to be made into a virtual prop. And that includes putting plenty of tracking markers on it. And also doing a survey shot, or the whole thing could fall apart. You also have to change your acting, because this here wouldn't work as she steps in front of the markers. So we would have to have her stop. Move the chair while we can still see the markers. And only then sit down. Or walk in from the other side. Anything we use as a placeholder also has to be smaller than whatever we're putting on top. Otherwise, if this is the cup she's holding, but this is the cup we're putting in, there will be a hole in the mat. Altogether, doing these kinds of virtual props is asking for trouble, and you really shouldn't. But there's also really no point in doing them unless you need some unusual object you can only make in 3D. For everything else, you should use real objects, like real chairs, which we can then handle any way we want. Or real cups, which then require zero post-production work and even have specular highlights. Or real furniture. Then we'll also get real contact shadows that we get to keep, and the whole thing will look more real. This kind of interaction here would be very difficult to simulate. But the only things that should be real are things that will actually be touched. Because the less we're trying to shoot at the same time, the easier it is to control. So in the airplane scene from before, she's sitting in a real chair and touching a real control stick. Everything else is built around her, especially the glass, which should never be real. You should also consider having practical lighting be real. If we wanted a 3D lamp in the scene, we'd need both the lamp itself as well as some light to fall on her. Instead of trying to come up with some weird lighting setup, it's perfectly acceptable to simply have the entire prop be real. Then we can shoot it in 10 seconds and move on. Keeping the immediate surroundings real is not just for interaction, it also looks more real. We've seen before that 3D risks falling apart when we're too close. That's why some people like to have the entire set near the actor be real, and then everything else is virtual. That way, physical contact is not a problem. It also allows us to cast and receive complicated shadows very easily. It's wise to see shadows as a kind of interaction, because visually it's just as complicated. With themselves. Because we've already seen how that can ruin a performance. You need stand-ins for timing interaction, for eyeline interaction, and especially physical interaction. You can either use a person, or if you're acting against a fantasy character, that'll be done in 3D. Make a wood cutout using some poster software. Cut it out. And then you have a cutout you can hide a voice actor behind. And the actor's performance will be much more in tune with the character. You obviously need to be able to remove the stand-in, which is not a problem in, for example, a right-angle master. But you have to feel certain that the main actor won't step over or behind, which is suddenly a roto problem. If the stand-in is going to occupy the same screen space as the actor, you have to be sure that it's small enough that the 3D character will composite right over it. A mic stand works great to at least have something to fixate on. And as a bonus, it also helps with the match move. But it only works in the foreground and on a static character. A mic stand in the background is no easier to remove than a full-figure stand-in. To keep the correct eyeline without actually having the stand-in in the shot, there's a trick you can do, which is to move the stand-in back along the eyeline. In the shot, the actor's eyes look exactly the same, and the audience will never know the difference. When the stand-in is behind the actor, you can also move it back along the eyeline, although it doesn't help as much. But you're also fine moving it off to the side, because the eyeline is not really clear to begin with when people are facing away. The next step in keeping it real is to block and shoot as if you're on a real set. One of the most common mistakes people make is to forget to imagine the final set. And the end result is very often people dead in the middle of the screen. If you knew that this was the final shot, you would want to frame the actor over here. And this is how you should be framing. Don't ever just shoot the actor, take the whole scene into account. People especially tend to think in a single layer when they're on a green screen, whereas on a real set you would always think in foreground and background. You have to bring that mentality with you. So if the final shot has a statue that could become foreground, frame for it on the set. Don't wait until post to decide what goes where. You can certainly make up the foreground later as we did in the embassy scene, and you should always do last-minute set dressing anyway. But you can do much more interesting things if you plan for it. You should also remember every framing technique that you know from regular filmmaking. The rule of thirds, for example, is there to give balance so that you're both shooting the actor and her surroundings. By keeping this rule in mind on a green screen, you tend to do shots that gracefully give space to both the actor and the background, even if you don't yet know what the exact background will be. Also think about your camera height and your horizon line. On a green screen, there's almost no difference between this shot and this. But in the composite, they're very different, with one showing the horizon and the other clearly not. If you have a big virtual environment you want to show, you have to be careful not to inadvertently shoot downwards. Down the same line, also consider that the floor isn't real. In the airplane scene, we were imagining the ocean beneath her. And we deliberately angled the shot downwards as we flew over her. It takes a stretch of the imagination to shoot the set and not the green screen. But you have to, because we can't simply change the camera angle afterwards. The same way, you have to consider parallax. In regular filmmaking, you instinctively try to get something into the foreground to give you a sense of movement. But all that's missing on a green screen. It's important to realize that it's parallax that gives you your sense of speed, not the actual dolly speed. If you remember this excerpt from the blocking course, changing the foreground's distance to the camera dramatically changed our sense of how fast we were moving. That means that without at least some objects to test on, you could seriously misjudge your speed. People tend to move the camera way too fast on a green screen because they can't really feel the move. But if you put in some placeholder objects, it's suddenly obvious that it's too fast. And that this is a more appropriate speed. Then you take out the placeholders for the take. But now you know it's a good speed, even if it doesn't look like much. Need is green behind the actor. And that means you can turn any location into a giant green screen, and then do as physically large moves as you want. But in this chapter, we're more interested in how to fake a bigger stage than what we really have, by extending match moves. For example, in the airplane scene, we started pretty close and flew in and over the actor. And then just sort of ended nowhere. Yet in the composite, we started much further away, flew in faster, and peeled out at the end. Another typical example is flying over to an office building and right up to a person. It's important for you as a director to understand how this works because you'll want to use it. Basically, a match move gives us a stretch of time where the camera is controlled by the match move data. During that time, we can't make any changes to the camera move or the 3D wouldn't match the background plate anymore. But it's perfectly okay to extend the camera move simply by placing new keyframes before and after. Then the move starts earlier, hits the match move, and at some point exits the match move and continues as a regular keyframed camera. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't actually work that well, because you can feel when we hit the match move as if we suddenly hit some tracks. The more difference there is in the speed, the more we feel a bump when we lock into the match move. So the trick is really how to get in and out in a smooth way. And this is a little bit technical, but you need to know it because it changes how you have to shoot it. We first of all have a match move that's the last half of the move up to the actor. To extend that with a longer fly-in, we need to create a second 3D camera that represents the extreme position that we want to start from, which is out here. And then we create a third 3D camera, which has half the position of each camera. And with a slider, we can control which of the first two cameras this camera is more magnetic to. Then the trick is that we crossfade from the extreme camera into the moving camera. So the virtual camera smoothly transitions into the moving camera. Again, we start in the extreme position and slowly become more magnetic to the second camera. This seems like a lot of work. But now we have a completely smooth transition from extension to match move. There's still a little slowdown, but it's much better than before. This is exactly what we did in the airplane shot. We created a further away 3D camera, and then a third 3D camera that faded from the extreme camera into the match move camera, giving us a totally smooth transition and a bigger camera move. This is something you need to take into consideration when you're shooting, because you shouldn't just shoot a small chunk near the actor and hope to glue something before it. Instead, you have to make sure that the dolly is moving well in advance, so you have something to crossfade on. So use all the track you have available and do the longest possible move. Now, a problem with extending a match move is that the live action and the 3D camera only match for the duration of the match move. And if we start changing the 3D camera position before, the green screen footage, of course, just stays the same. That means that the green screen footage has to be resized to fit with the extension. And some people do that in compositing. We did it by placing the background element as an image plane in the 3D scene, and literally filming the image plane with the extended camera. Then she fits right inside the cockpit all the time, and we didn't have to hand match her size. But regardless of how you do it, there's an important limitation, which is that you can only extend moves in a straight line, because the only thing you can do to the green screen footage is resize it. We can't simply start shooting the scene from a completely different angle, because the live action is just a flat plane. The only other extension you can do is to pan the footage in and out, because it's again a simple 2D operation that affects the live action and the 3D in the same way. And finally, if you design the move so the actor clears the frame, you can go anywhere afterwards. So in the airplane scene, we did all three. In the beginning, we do a straight line extension for a longer flight. And in the end, we pan out. Or actually, the airplane peels out, but it's the same. And afterwards, we can move the camera anywhere. These are things you can always count on doing. But try not to extend with something that's radically different or much faster or slower. For example, morphing, or changing the speed of a clip. The simplest kind of warp is called a grid warp, and it works by overlaying a grid. And then you can pull the grid points to distort the image. And then she's been warped. Now, the reason we say that this only works on a green screen is that if we do the same on a shot that has a background, the background is stretched too. To do a good-looking warp, we actually have to do it on a uniform background, so we can't see that the background is being stretched. Then we can composite it over a clean plate afterwards. A specific technique that's based on warping is called morphing. The workflow is that you identify points that represent the same feature in the starting image and in the ending image, and then the software simply warps and fades at the same time. But again, this only works properly on a neutral background. When we do it on a real background, the background stretches and warps with it. So again, do it on a green screen so you get separate elements. And composite it into a clean plate. The final kind of warping we'll talk about is retiming, where the software creates in-between frames to slow it down. To do this, the software analyzes the motion of pixels and then warps the image to find the in-between frames of the movement. On a green screen, this is almost identical to using a high-speed camera. And many people actually shoot a little bit high speed on green screen, and then slow it down even more in post without using double the film. The key here is very quick, so only look at the motion. But again, this doesn't work so great on regular live action, because the area around the person is warping too. And on a camera move, you get some severe artifacts from the warping. This happens most on heavy parallax. On more subtle parallax, you might actually get away with it. Or not, it's hard to predict. So again, you're better off doing all your retiming on a green screen. First of all, the goal is as much depth of field as possible, so use a small aperture. And consider 2/3 inch video instead of 35mm film because it automatically has a wide depth of field. Do as little motion blur as possible, so use a fast shutter. If you want motion blur, software can recreate it. You want a low ISO so there's less noise. And you want to avoid polarizers for glare because they eat 2 stops. You never want to shoot anything out of focus, so if you have over-the-shoulder dialogue, shoot one character at a time. And do the blur in post. You would have had a very hard time keying this, but it only works for lock shots or motion control. You never want to use filters except NDs and basic balancing. Use prime lenses if you have the choice. For wide-angle lenses, get ones with as little distortion as possible. It's better for the match-moving math and compositing. For exposure, you only get perfect green screen with a real channel test on your combination of equipment. Then you can learn a good spot meter setting and trust that level, even when you're working fast. Don't ever use incident meters because they don't take the reflectiveness of the green screen into account. Waveform monitors are best for checking screen evenness, but not exposure because they use weighted average. Although RGB waveform monitors are as good as a channel test. On a large green screen, the posterize method gives you a better picture of evenness than anything else. On film, if you can't do a channel test, use the white card method. Expose the 90% white card at key. And then looking through a double-folded filter, match the green screen to the white card, or the key level to the green screen. Finally, back the green screen exposure off by a stop to be safe. After that, you can calibrate the spot meter to read the green screen directly through the filter. Consider that paint selection is a factor in exposure. There are several stops difference in different paints. Pro paints are so bright that they can force you to underexpose everything else. So hardware store paint is often better outdoors than on a psych stage. For backdrop green screen, it doesn't matter because you have individual control. For green inserts in indoor lighting, pro paints can be better because of the extra brightness. KinoFlow green tubes can be great for beefing up backdrop green screen, but we don't think it's ultimately that important. And it doesn't work on a psych. Outdoors, you can control green screen exposure by tilting the screen. Consider that zoom can change your exposure, so if you change lens or focal length, recheck the exposure. For video cameras, you want to shoot with the sharpness at its lowest value, even if it looks very soft on the monitor. This is the raw signal, and you can always bring it back with a process called unsharp mask, which artificially increases edge contrast but hurts the key. And this is all the camera would have done anyway. For video saturation or color matrix, it's okay to increase your saturation to increase channel separation, as long as you don't clip any channels. You're not gaining any new information, but it'll be compressed better in the codec. You want to shoot 444 or the highest data rate and bit depth you can. Compression is the #1 enemy of keying. For matching lighting, the best thing you can do is faithfully match the destination. Never ever do safe even lighting unless that's your goal, because it'll never composite. There's no way to light things in post. So always make a lighting decision, especially pick a key side, and the animators will have to match it. Have at least 2 to 3 stops between key and fill so the compositor can select the final ratio. Always shoot with clean untinted lighting. Any tint should be done in post. The only exception is if you have multiple color temperatures, then you have to shoot it in the final light. For reverse shot dialogue, consider that you don't have to physically flip the camera setup. To make a reverse shot, we can just flip the characters. And then the lighting.
and then they cut fine.
It's less work and needs a smaller stage. In preparation for keying, you want the screen to be even, but the compositor can always do multiple keyers, so it's not always a big deal. It has to be very even if you want to do transparency keying, like see-through objects, or extracting shadows. Even markers are too much variance, and you must do perfect green screen for transparency to work. Also shoot a lock clean plate anytime you remember. Never do anything to help with the key, like backlighting or opposite colors. You just create problems. But use spill cloth heavily. We've skimped on spill cloth throughout this course, but the improvement is dramatic. And if you care about quality, you have to use it as much as possible. For tracking, you don't need any markers for lock shots. But always write down the camera height. You need 2 markers for pan tilt shots, and they can never be obscured. Any moving camera shot is automatically a match moving shot, and you have to follow all the rules. Always remember parallax stands. Also make sure to put markers on spill cloth, and remember that all markers must be frozen. Don't zoom during match move shots if you can help it. Zooming is bad for the math. And always take lots of still pictures of the stage from different angles because they can save a match move. In telecine, do a clean scan unless you know what you're doing. Never do any selective color correction like DaVinci Power Windows to bring out the green. They ruin it. Only do overall color correction to extract more information from the film. And never clip any channel or do gamma treatment. Only black and white level adjustments. Always telecine direct to disc at the highest, most uncompressed resolution. It's okay to do a low-res version for editing as long as you never key from it. And finally, when you scan, it's important to never change the principal point. The scan must be absolutely in the optical center, or the match move has problems.